Hello and welcome to another episode of Communication How. We have been dealing with the traditions of communication theory, and so far we have seen the semiotic tradition, the phenomenological tradition, the cybernetic tradition, and today we shall be dealing with the socio-psychological tradition. Now, what does this tradition deal with? What is this tradition all about? And how does it impact our way of communicating? All that and more we shall deal when we take a look at the socio-psychological tradition. So when we look at ourselves, first and foremost, it is almost certain that we think of ourselves first as individuals. So we have a body, a brain, and a skin that basically marks a boundary between ourselves and the world outside. At the same time, we also have a unique appearance. And even if one is an identical twin, we see that the face is never exactly the same as anyone else's. Now, the same is also true about our personality. It is said we assume that we have a certain combination of traits that make us different from other people. But at the same time, we are also clearly aware that we are not an island. Man is a social animal, and therefore he requires to be part of the community. And therefore, as an individual, being part of the community is very much important and integral to his overall development. And we see that by being part of a community, we are thus bound together by social interaction. Now, the study of an individual as a social being is the thrust of the socio-psychological tradition. Now, originating in the field of social psychology, this tradition has been a powerful tradition within communication. The theories of this tradition will focus on certain aspects, and we shall now take a look at what are these areas of focus of the socio-psychological tradition. Now, we see that first and foremost, the focus is on the individual social behavior. How does an individual react, or how does he integrate himself within the society? How does he act with the other persons? Next, we also see that the socio-psychological tradition focuses on psychological variables. And we see that these variables play a very important part in our day-to-day lives. Next, we also see that the focus is on individual effects. How come certain things affect individuals in different ways? We also have personalities and traits, which are yet another focus of the socio-psychological tradition. Apart from this, we also have perception, the way we perceive the world around us, and cognition, the way the mental processes within us determine our outcome and the way we approach a particular situation. Now we see that although these theories may have many differences, they share a common concern for behavior and for personal traits and cognitive processes, which in turn produce behavior. Now we need to look at the individualistic approach that characterizes the socio-psychological tradition. And we see that this individualistic approach, which characterizes this socio-psychological tradition, is common in the study of communication, and it is especially common in the behavioral and social sciences at large. Now, this is understandable within our cultural milieu. Now, the individual has dominated Western thought since the 18th century Enlightenment. And we see that the autonomous person is the primary unit of analysis in much of Western thinking. And therefore, we see that a lot of research has been done on the individual himself and how the individual is able to relate with the others. A lot of study on the psyche, on the working of the mind, on the working of the individual himself has been taken place. And thus we see that this psychological view sees persons as entities. It sees persons as entities with characteristics that lead them to behave in certain independent ways. Now, it also views the single human mind as the locus for processing and understanding information. At the same time, we see that there is a lot of processing that is happening in our minds constantly. We are receiving a lot of data from all our senses, and all this data is processed in quick time through our mind, and thus we are able to respond to certain situations in the right possible manner. Now, at the same time, we also see that the human mind is also the one that generates messages. Now, this socio-psychological tradition acknowledges that the power that individuals can have over other individuals and the effects of information on the human mind is very important. That means we as individuals, we can convince other people through a way of acting, through a way of approaching, etc. And in this way, we see that because we are able to influence other people, because we are able to have an effect on the others around us, it also has an effect on the information that we try to convey to one another. And therefore, it is hardly surprising that the psychological explanations have been so appealing to many communication scholars, especially with regard to the study of attitude change and the interaction effects. At this point of time, it is important to look at some of the key ideas in the socio-psychological tradition. Now, we see that in the socio-psychological tradition, psychological explanations are very important because the socio-psychological tradition tries to study what is happening with the human mind, how the human is able to do all these sort of things, process information, etc. And in this way, we see that the universal mechanisms that govern action are assumed to be discoverable through careful research. That means once you are able to do certain research on certain areas, you are able to clearly identify and discover what are the various mechanisms that are at work within the human person. Now, at the same time, we see that this tradition is most often associated with the science of communication. And therefore, much of the current work in this tradition especially focuses on persuasion and attitude change. That means basically with regards to message processing, how individual plan message strategies, how receivers process message information, and the effects of messages on individuals. And thus we see that a still popular part of the socio-psychological approach is the trait theory. And we see that this trait theory identifies personality variables and communicator tendencies. And it tries to see how this affects the individual's act and interactions. So in this way, we see that there are certain personality variables that play a very important role. And also each one of us as a communicator, we tend to have certain tendencies that we normally use in our communication styles. And therefore we see that these personality variables can also have an effect on how we as individuals act towards others and basically our interaction with other people as well as the environment. So with this being said, we can now move to the socio-psychological theories, the thrust of it. So we see that most socio-psychological theories of communication are cognitive in orientation. And as a result, they provide insights into the ways human beings process information. They basically explain individual human information processing systems. And in this area, we see that the socio-psychological and the cybernetic traditions come together to explain individual human information processing systems. And we see that of special interest in this area are the inputs, that is the information that the person receives, as well as the outputs, that is the plan and behavior of the cognitive systems. Now we see that questions of importance to this line of investigation include how perceptions, mechanisms, and various other kind of systems within us that serve attention, retention, interference, selection, motivation, planning, and strategizing. Now we need to look at some of the assumptions that are there in this socio-psychological tradition. Now, what are they? Well, first and foremost, we see that the tradition assumes that mechanisms of human information processing are beyond our awareness. That means there are certain processes that are taking place simultaneously, which sometimes happen unconsciously. We are not aware of it happening in real time, but it still takes place. And in this way, we see that these processes, this information processes cycle, which takes place, is discoverable only through thorough analysis and research. Whereas on our own, we may not be aware of the amount of information that we are constantly processing at every minute or at every second. Next, we also see that as communicators, we may be made aware of specific aspects of the process, such as attention and memory. And we may also be aware of certain outputs, such as plans and behavior. But we see that the internal processes themselves are behind the scenes. So that means you may be made aware by certain factors of your attention, of your memory, and also you are aware of your plans and behaviors. But there are still a lot of things going on in the background, at the back of your mind, which sometimes you may not be even aware of. And in this way, we see that communication scientists seek to discover and describe these systems. And we see that there are several themes in the socio-psychological tradition. Now, which are those themes? Let's have a look at them. So first and foremost, they ask various questions. How can individual communication be predicted? How does an individual take into account and accommodate different communication situations? Next, how do communicators adapt their behaviors to one another? How is information used in forming message strategies and plans? How do people make decisions about the types of messages that they wish to use? How is meaning represented in the mind? How do people attribute the causes of behavior? How is information integrated to form beliefs and attitudes? How do our attitudes change? How are messages assimilated in belief and attitude systems? How are expectations formed in interaction with others? Basically, the variations in this tradition try to answer these questions in various ways. And having looked at all these aspects, having looked at the key features, having looked at the assumptions and the themes of the socio-psychological tradition, we can now look at the salient features of the socio-psychological tradition. First and foremost, we see that the study of the individual as a social being is the thrust of the socio-psychological tradition. Now, this basically originates in the field of social psychology, and the theories of this tradition focus on psychological variables, individual effects, personalities, traits, perception, and cognition. And therefore, we see that the individual human mind is thus the focus of research in this tradition, because the mind is seen as the locus for processing and understanding information. Now, we have seen that how much information is constantly being processed in our minds regularly at every second. And therefore, we see that this theory, this tradition, tries to focus also on persuasion and attitude change. Basically, how humans develop, process, and strategize messages, as well as the effect of these messages on the individuals. And therefore, we see that when we take a look at the socio-psychological tradition, it basically tries to focus itself on this persuasion and attitude change, which forms a very important part of human interaction and communication with others. At the same time, we see that the socio-psychological tradition can be divided into three main branches. And here we have the behavioral branch, the cognitive branch, and the biological branch. And therefore, when you take a look at each of these branches, we see that when it comes to the behavioral branch, the theories in the behavioral branch concentrate on how people actually behave in communication situations. That means when an individual is placed in various situations, how does he react? How does he involve himself in that situation? How does he interact with others? And most importantly, how does he act when faced with certain challenges, etc. Next, we have the cognitive branch. And when we take a look at the cognitive branch, we see that the center of this study is basically on patterns of thoughts. And therefore, this branch concentrates on how individuals acquire, store, and process information. And in a way, all this leads to behavioral outputs. So basically, when you acquire information, when you process it, when you store it, you are able to then produce certain outputs. And that comes out as behaviors. That comes out as your interaction with others around you. So therefore, we see that the cognitive branch is constantly interested in this constant processing of information and constant storing and output processing that takes place. Next, the third branch is the biological branch. And here we see that as the study of genetics has basically assumed a lot of importance in the recent times, psychologists and other behavioral researchers are increasing their interest in knowing the effects of brain function and structure. They are at the same time also interested in neurochemistry and genetic factors that play a very important role in explaining human behavior. And in this way, we see that uncertainty reduction theory and expectancy violation theory are examples within this social psychological tradition, because they are centered on the cognitive processes that impact the human communication behavior. In a way, the choices we make in terms of how to reduce uncertainty and how to deal with violations of expectations can affect the outcome of certain interactions that we have. So this is basically all that we have for the socio-psychological tradition. As we see that the main focus of this is on the human mind. How does the mind process information, and how does this lead to various outputs and behavioral as well as interaction patterns with others. And therefore, as we have dealt with the socio-psychological tradition, we shall now next time deal with the socio-cultural tradition. So till then, thank you for watching this video, and let us meet next time as we deal with the socio-cultural tradition. Thank you.